The road stretched endlessly into the dense woods, the setting sun painting the sky with streaks of crimson and orange. Ethan, Maya, and Leo were headed to a secluded cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness, a weekend getaway to escape their exhausting city lives. Ethan drove with a confident air, the map app on his phone guiding their way, while Maya and Leo laughed over a playlist of old songs in the back seat. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the map app began glitching. The blue route line blinked on and off before rerouting them down a dirt road that barely seemed wide enough for a car. "This can't be right," Maya said, leaning forward to look at the screen. Ethan shrugged. "It's probably just a shortcut. These apps are smarter than us." Leo chuckled nervously. "Yeah, but they don't have common sense." They pressed on, the dirt road winding deeper into the forest. The trees loomed closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the car. The headlights illuminated a weathered wooden sign. Hollow Ridge Road. "We're definitely not on the main road anymore," Maya muttered. But Ethan, determined not to let the trip go off course, waved her concerns away. "It's an adventure, right?" The further they drove, the quieter the forest seemed. No birds chirped, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just the crunch of gravel beneath their tires and the occasional scrape of a branch against the car. Then they saw it. A dark figure standing in the middle of the road. Ethan slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, wearing tattered clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. "Is he okay?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the man raised an arm and pointed down the road. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as though he were guiding them. "Drive," Leo urged, his voice sharp with fear. Ethan hesitated, but then accelerated. The man didn't move as they passed, his figure vanishing into the darkness of the rearview mirror. "Okay, that was weird," Ethan admitted, gripping the wheel tightly. The road narrowed further, forcing Ethan to slow down. The forest seemed to press against the car, and soon the trees on either side were so close their branches scraped the windows. "What kind of shortcut is this?" Leo muttered, peering nervously out the window. Suddenly, the road forked, and the app froze again. Ethan groaned, frustrated. "Left or right?" "Right," Maya said instinctively, though she had no real reason. Ethan turned right, and the dirt road gave way to something worse. The ground was uneven, riddled with rocks and roots. The car jostled violently, the suspension groaning. "Are we sure this is a road?" Leo asked, gripping the door handle. Ahead, a faint light flickered in the distance. Relief washed over the group. "Maybe it's a cabin or something," Maya said. Ethan sped up, desperate to reach civilization. But as they got closer, the light revealed itself to be an old gas station. Its neon sign buzzed erratically, spelling out "Stop and Go" in flickering letters. "Let's ask for directions," Ethan suggested, pulling into the gravel lot. The station looked abandoned. The windows were caked with grime, the gas pumps rusted and leaning, but the light in the office was on. "I'll check it out," Ethan said, stepping out of the car. "Are you serious?" Maya hissed. "I'll be quick," he promised. Ethan pushed open the creaking door and disappeared inside. Maya and Leo sat in silence, watching the darkened forest around them. Minutes passed. "He should have been back by now," Maya said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "No way," Leo said. "We wait." But Maya was already stepping out of the car. She approached the gas station cautiously, calling Ethan's name. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of oil and decay. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. "Ethan?" The office was empty. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with outdated snacks and cans. A door behind the counter stood ajar, leading into the back. She hesitated but stepped through. The smell hit her first, iron, metallic, and sharp. The back room was small, cluttered with tools and rags soaked in dark stains. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling, casting shifting shadows. In the corner, she saw it, Ethan's phone, screen cracked, lying in a pool of something dark and wet. Maya turned to run but collided with something solid. The man from the road. His face was wrong, impossibly wrong. Eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a grin that split his cheeks. His hands closed around her arms, pulling her deeper into the room. Outside, Leo waited, drumming his fingers on the dashboard. A sharp knock on the car window made him jump. It was Maya. She was smiling, but something about her eyes wasn't right. "Where's Ethan?" he asked, rolling the window down slightly. "He's inside," she said softly. "Come help me get him." Her voice was flat, mechanical. Leo hesitated, then glanced back at the gas station. The light inside flickered ominously. "I'll wait here," he said. Maya's smile faltered, replaced by a blank expression. Wrong choice, she said, her voice suddenly distorted. Before Leo could react, the car doors locked and the engine died. From the woods, shadows emerged, figures moving unnaturally, their limbs jerking like marionettes. They surrounded the car, their faces twisted in grotesque masks of human features. Leo screamed as the figures began to claw at the windows, their nails scraping like knives on glass, and then the lights went out.
Story number 2.
The night was suffocatingly dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed the headlights of Danny's truck as he drove down the unfamiliar stretch of highway. He was running late, the result of one too many beers at the diner before hitting the road. His destination was still hours away, and the GPS on his phone kept losing signal. The highway, lined with endless stretches of trees, seemed deserted. No other cars, no signs of life. Just an oppressive silence that made him feel like the only person left in the world. When the GPS rerouted for the third time, Danny swore under his breath. A new direction popped up on the screen, leading him down a smaller road. He glanced at the name, Cold Hollow Trail. He hesitated, but figured it was better than driving aimlessly. The moment he turned onto the trail, he regretted it. The road was barely wide enough for his truck, with dense forest on either side. Shadows danced across the windshield as the truck's headlights sliced through the thick canopy. Danny rolled down his window slightly, hoping the fresh air would keep him alert. But instead of fresh air, he caught the faintest whiff of something rotten. Damn deer carcass or something, he muttered, rolling the window back up. The farther he drove, the worse the smell became. And then he saw it. A car. It was parked at an odd angle, its hazard lights faintly blinking in the darkness. The car was an older model, its paint dull and scratched. Danny slowed down, debating whether to stop. He squinted through his windshield, trying to make out if someone was inside. The driver's door was open, but the interior was empty. His pulse quickened as he noticed scratches along the sides of the car, deep gouges that looked like claw marks. The passenger door hung slightly ajar, and something dark and wet dripped from the handle. Keep driving, he told himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But as he passed the car, his headlights caught something in the woods, a figure standing perfectly still. It was tall, unnaturally so, with impossibly long arms that hung limply by its sides. Its face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, but featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, blank skin. Danny's foot slammed on the gas, the truck roaring down the road. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, convinced that if he did, the figure would be closer. The road twisted and turned, each bend revealing more suffocating darkness. And then the truck jolted violently. A flat tire. Of course, Danny spat, his voice shaking. He pulled over, heart hammering in his chest. He debated staying in the truck, but he knew he couldn't drive on the rim. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped into the suffocating darkness. The air was colder now, and the stench of rot was overwhelming. He knelt by the flat tire, his hands fumbling with the spare. The forest around him was silent, too silent. As he worked, he felt it. A presence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he froze, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. Slowly, he turned his head. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was the figure. It hadn't moved, but its head was tilted now, as if curious. Danny's breath hitched. The flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, he heard the crunch of leaves. When the beam returned, the figure was closer. Nope, not doing this, Danny muttered, abandoning the tire and scrambling back into the truck. He locked the doors, started the engine, and floored it, driving on the flat tire. The truck protested with a horrible grinding noise, but Danny didn't care. He had to get out of there. The GPS flickered to life briefly, showing him a winding path ahead. But as he glanced down at the screen, something caught his eye. The back seat. There was something in the back seat. He didn't dare turn around. His peripheral vision caught glimpses. Long, spindly limbs folding unnaturally, the faint gleam of pale skin in the darkness. A guttural sound filled the truck, low and inhuman. Danny screamed, swerving wildly. The truck veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The impact knocked him unconscious. When he came to, the truck was silent. The windshield was shattered, and the faint glow of dawn peeked through the trees. Danny groaned, his head pounding. He unbuckled his seatbelt, wincing as he moved, and then he remembered. The back seat. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. It was empty. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. From the woods came the sound of crunching leaves, growing louder and closer. And then a voice, soft and distorted, whispering his name. Danny! He stumbled out of the truck, running blindly into the forest. Behind him, the whispering grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was a pale, featureless face emerging from the shadows, its head tilting in eerie curiosity. No one ever found Danny. But locals say that if you drive down Cold Hollow Trail late at night, you might hear your name whispered from the trees. And if you stop to look, you'll see it, tall, pale, and waiting.
Story number 3.
The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the windshield of Claire's old sedan. She squinted through the downpour, trying to make out the faint road ahead. Her GPS had lost signal miles ago, and now she was navigating by sheer instinct on this winding, desolate highway. Her fingers tightened on the wheel as the forest on either side of the road seemed to close in. The trees were unnaturally tall and gnarled, their branches stretching over the road like skeletal arms. Her car's gas gauge dipped into the red. Great, she muttered. Just what I need. A flash of light caught her attention. A neon sign up ahead, flickering weakly in the rain. Last Chance Motel, it read in broken, sputtering letters. Claire pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching as she parked near the entrance. The building was small, just a single row of rooms with peeling paint and cracked windows. A dim porch light illuminated a rusted bell by the door. The rain soaked her in seconds as she ran to the entrance. She pushed the door open, a creak echoing into the empty lobby. "Hello?" she called out. A man appeared from the shadows behind the counter, startling her. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as wax and his eyes sunken. His lips stretched into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice raspy. Yeah," Claire said, brushing wet hair from her face. "Just for the night." The man nodded slowly, sliding an old-fashioned key across the counter. "Room 7, down at the end." Claire forced a polite smile, grabbed the key, and made her way back into the rain. Room 7 was the furthest from the office, its door hanging slightly ajar. She pushed it open, the smell of mildew hitting her instantly. The room was small, with a single bed covered in a thin, stained blanket. A flickering bulb buzzed overhead. "Cozy," she muttered, shutting the door behind her. As she peeled off her wet jacket, she noticed something odd. Scratches along the inside of the door. Deep gouges, as though someone or something had been clawing at it. She shook off the unease and locked the door. The rain continued to hammer outside, but the room was eerily silent. No hum of a heater, no creak of the building settling. Just silence. Claire sat on the bed and pulled out her phone. Still no signal. She sighed and leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling. A sudden knock at the door jolted her upright. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. She hesitated. "Who is it?" No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Claire's heart raced. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just the dim flicker of the porch light casting long shadows. She exhaled shakily and stepped back. Then the knock came again, this time from the window. She froze. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the outline of a figure standing just outside. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Claire grabbed the room phone from the bedside table, only to realize it was dead. No dial tone. The figure at the window pressed closer, the silhouette becoming more distinct. It wasn't quite human. The limbs were too long, the head too large. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed something else. The scratches on the door. They weren't old. They were fresh. She backed away as the window rattled, the figure pressing harder against the glass. Without thinking, she grabbed her car keys and bolted for the door. She flung it open and sprinted into the rain, not daring to look back. The gravel shifted under her feet as she reached her car and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and she peeled out of the lot, the motel disappearing in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her as she reached the main road, the rain beginning to lighten. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror again, her stomach dropped. A figure was sitting in the back seat. Its face was pale and featureless, its body hunched unnaturally. Long, spindly fingers reached over the seat, brushing her shoulder. Claire's scream echoed into the storm as the car veered off the road and into the trees. The wreckage was found days later, but Claire was never seen again. Locals warned travelers to avoid the Last Chance Motel, especially during storms. They say if you stay there, you might not leave alone.
Story number 4.
Megan didn't plan to take the old dirt road. She'd left work late, rushing to make it home before the storm rolled in. Her usual route was blocked by an accident, and with her phone's battery dead, she had no choice but to follow the hand-painted sign that read, Detour. The road was rough, potholes jostling her tiny sedan as she drove deeper into unfamiliar territory. Towering trees lined both sides, their skeletal branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "This better lead somewhere," Megan muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. Minutes turned into an hour, and her frustration grew. The dirt road seemed endless, winding through the forest without a single sign of life. Her headlights barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only the narrow path ahead. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed the brakes, her car skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were ragged, hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though his neck had been twisted too far. Megan honked, her heart pounding. "Get out of the road." The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward the car. Panic surged through her. She threw the car into reverse, her tires spinning in the mud. The man continued to approach, his movements jerky like a puppet on strings. As her car reversed, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," she cried, frantically turning the key. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging her into total darkness. Megan's breath came in shallow gasps as she fumbled for her flashlight in the glove compartment. The beam of light wavered as she shone it out the windshield. The road was empty. The man was gone. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A sound came from behind her, a soft tapping on the back window. Her blood ran cold. Slowly she turned, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam landed on the rear window where a face stared back at her. It was the man, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. His hands pressed against the glass, leaving greasy smears as he began to claw at the window. Megan screamed, throwing open her door and stumbling into the night. The rain had begun to fall, turning the dirt road into a slick mess. She ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping at her face and arms. The sound of heavy footsteps followed her, impossibly fast and growing closer. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice lost in the storm. She tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight flying from her hand. The beam landed on a cluster of trees ahead, illuminating something carved into the bark. It was a symbol, a crude, circular design with jagged lines radiating from its center. Before she could move, a hand closed around her ankle, yanking her backward. She kicked wildly, her fingers clawing at the mud as she was dragged toward the trees. She twisted her body, her flashlight catching the man's face again. It wasn't human anymore. His skin was pale and stretched too tight, his eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Megan screamed again, digging her nails into the earth, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the symbol carved into the trees, glowing faintly as if alive. Weeks later, a hiker found Megan's abandoned car on the dirt road, its engine cold and its doors wide open. The forest around it was eerily silent, as though even the animals knew to stay away. Locals tell stories about that road, claiming it's cursed. They say the symbols in the trees mark a place where the boundary between worlds is thin. If you're unlucky enough to find yourself there, you might not make it back. And if you do, you'll never be the same.
Story number 5.
The evening had started out innocently enough. Mike, Jenna, and Tom were on their way back from a weekend camping trip. Their GPS suggested a shortcut to shave off 2 hours, but the road it directed them to was barely visible, a narrow dirt trail winding into the dense woods. "This doesn't look right," Jenna said, eyeing the path suspiciously from the passenger seat. "It's fine," Mike replied confidently. "We'll save time. Trust me." Tom, sitting in the back, shrugged. "Shortcut or not, this feels like the start of every horror movie ever." The group laughed nervously, but as they drove deeper into the forest, the jokes faded. The trees pressed in on either side, their twisted branches clawing at the car. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires. Then the headlights caught something up ahead, a wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read, "Turn back." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. "That's not creepy at all." Mike smirked but didn't slow down. Probably some prank. People put up weird signs to mess with travelers. But Tom wasn't laughing anymore. "Dude, seriously, let's turn around." "Relax," Mike said. "It's fine." The road narrowed further, the overhanging branches forming a tunnel. The car's headlights struggled to pierce the darkness, and the atmosphere grew oppressive, like the forest itself was watching them. A few minutes later, they saw it. A second sign, larger and more ominous. Last warning. Turn back. Jenna's voice trembled. Mike, please, let's just go back. Where? Mike snapped. The road's too narrow to turn around. We'll keep going until there's a clearing. Tom peered out the back window, his face pale. Guys, I think we're being followed. Jenna and Mike turned in their seats. In the distance, a faint pair of headlights glowed through the trees. It's probably just another car, Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. But the headlights weren't getting closer. They stayed at the same eerie distance, trailing them silently. A third sign appeared, its letters scrawled in red paint. Or was it blood? Too late. The car jolted as something struck the underside. What the hell was that? Jenna cried. Mike swerved, barely keeping the car on the narrow road. Probably a rock. The headlights behind them disappeared. Tom leaned forward, his voice low and panicked. It's not a rock. There's something out there. The car crested a small hill, and suddenly the forest opened into a clearing. Relief washed over Jenna as she saw a small, abandoned gas station ahead. Finally, she whispered. Mike pulled into the clearing and killed the engine. Let's check the map and figure out where we are. The gas station was a relic of the past, its paint peeling and its windows shattered. A rusty pump stood out front, covered in ivy. Jenna looked around uneasily. I don't like this. Tom glanced back toward the road. Where did those headlights go? As if in response, a soft, rhythmic tapping came from the trees. Tap, tap, tap. Did you hear that? Jenna whispered, clutching Mike's arm. Mike nodded, his bravado gone. Stay in the car. Before anyone could argue, the tapping grew louder, closer. Then they saw it. Emerging from the tree line was a figure, tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its head tilted from side to side, emitting a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. The group froze, watching in horror as the figure approached the gas station. Drive, Jenna hissed, her voice shaking. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. Come on, Mike yelled, pounding the steering wheel. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head snapping toward the car. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, except for a single, wide grin carved into its pale skin. Jenna screamed as the creature began to sprint toward them, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Get out! Run! Tom shouted, throwing open his door. The group scattered, sprinting into the woods. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps as she weaved through the trees, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls pursuing her. She risked a glance back and immediately wished she hadn't. The creature was closer now, its grin impossibly wide, its arms reaching out for her. Ahead, she saw a faint glow, a cabin with a light in the window. Help! She screamed, pounding on the door as she reached it. The door creaked open. An old man stood inside, his eyes dark and hollow. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna turned back toward the forest. The creature was gone, but the old man stepped aside, revealing a room filled with symbols carved into the walls and candles burning low. You brought it with you, he said, his voice trembling. Before Jenna could respond, the tapping began again, this time on the cabin windows. Tap, tap, tap. The candles flickered, and the old man backed away, muttering prayers. Jenna's scream echoed into the night as the door flew open, and the grinning figure stepped inside. The cabin was found weeks later, abandoned and burned to the ground. No trace of Jenna, Mike, or Tom was ever discovered, but travelers on that dirt road sometimes report hearing faint screams, or worse, a rhythmic tapping on their car windows.
Story number 6.
The late autumn wind howled as Eric and his younger sister Emily drove down the isolated back road. Their plan had been simple: take a scenic route home after visiting their grandparents in the countryside. But now, as twilight faded into darkness, the twisting road felt anything but scenic. Are we lost? Emily asked, glancing at her brother. No, Eric replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the forest. The trees loomed close to the road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Up ahead, the headlights illuminated a crooked sign. Willow Creek, 6 miles. I've never heard of Willow Creek, Emily said, clutching her phone, though it showed no signal. It's probably just a small town, Eric said. We'll find a gas station or someone to ask for directions. But as they drove into the darkness, the uneasy feeling in Eric's chest grew stronger. The road narrowed, the trees pressing closer, their bark gnarled and twisted like grotesque faces. Then the car jolted. "What was that?" Emily yelped. Eric pulled over, his heart pounding. "Probably a pothole. Let me check." He stepped out, the cold wind biting at his face. The road behind them was empty, stretching into shadowy silence. Eric crouched to inspect the tires, but they were intact. He was about to stand when he noticed something strange. Long, thin gouges etched into the dirt road. They weren't tire marks. "Eric, hurry up," Emily called nervously. He stood, brushing off his jeans. "It's fine. Probably just—" A sound interrupted him. Rustling. It came from the trees to his left, faint at first, then louder, as if something was moving quickly through the underbrush. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice shaky. No answer. "Get in the car!" Emily shouted. Eric didn't need to be told twice. He jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it. "What was it?" Emily asked, her eyes wide. "Probably an animal," he said, but even he didn't believe it. As they continued down the road, the forest seemed to grow darker, the headlights barely cutting through the thickening shadows. Eric glanced at the clock. It had stopped, frozen at 8:17. "I don't like this," Emily muttered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the road ahead. Eric slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress that hung off her thin frame. Her head was tilted down, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. "Is she okay?" Emily whispered. "I don't know," Eric said, his hands gripping the wheel. He rolled down the window slightly. "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Eric honked the horn. The woman's head snapped up, and Emily screamed. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, black and empty like two deep holes. Her mouth stretched unnaturally across her face, filled with jagged teeth. "Go!" Emily shouted. Eric hit the gas, swerving around the woman, but as they passed her, she let out a high-pitched scream that echoed through the forest. "Did you see her face?" Emily cried, clutching her seatbelt. Eric didn't answer, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The road twisted and turned, but the feeling of dread only deepened. Then, in the rearview mirror, Eric saw her. The woman was running after them. Her movements were inhuman, her limbs jerking unnaturally as she closed the distance, her mouth open in a silent scream. "She's catching up!" Emily yelled, tears streaming down her face. Eric floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as they sped down the road. The woman disappeared from the mirror, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave. Finally, they saw it. A small bridge crossing a narrow creek. Beyond it, the forest seemed to thin. "We're almost out," Eric said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Emily or himself. They crossed the bridge, and for a brief moment, the feeling of dread lifted. The forest opened into a clearing, and a small town came into view. Willow Creek. But something was wrong. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and crumbling. A rusted gas station sign creaked in the wind, its letters faded and unreadable. "This place looks abandoned," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. Eric parked the car in front of what might have once been a diner. He got out cautiously, the air thick and still. Then he heard it. The sound of bare feet slapping against the pavement. He turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing. The woman, her head tilted, her wide black eyes fixed on him. Eric backed toward the car, but she began to run, her twisted limbs propelling her forward with terrifying speed. "Get in the car!" Emily screamed. Eric jumped in and started the engine, but the woman was already there, slamming her hands against the window. Her face was inches from his, her mouth stretching wider than before, impossibly wide, until it was all he could see. The last thing Eric heard was her laughter, sharp and cruel, as the world went dark. The car was found days later, abandoned at the edge of the bridge. There was no sign of Eric or Emily, but locals claim they sometimes hear laughter echoing through the woods near Willow Creek, a haunting sound that keeps them far, far away.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. 4 friends, Rachel, Sam, Lily, and Chris, had rented a remote cabin deep in the mountains. The air was crisp, and the forest stretched endlessly, a sea of golden leaves. The first day was uneventful, hiking, a barbecue, and jokes around the fire. But on the second night, things changed. Around midnight, as they sat playing cards in the dimly lit cabin, they heard it, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, 3 slow, measured taps on the front door. Rachel froze, her hand midair with a card. Who'd be out here this late? Probably a ranger, Chris said, though his voice wavered. He stood and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. Anyone there? Rachel asked. Chris shook his head. Nothing. He opened the door cautiously, the cold night air rushing in. The porch was empty. No one's there, he said, closing the door. They laughed it off nervously, to set blaming the wind or a falling branch. But as they settled back into their game, the knock came again. This time louder. Knock, knock, knock. Lily grabbed Sam's arm. It's not funny if one of you is messing around. We're all right here, Sam replied, his face pale. Chris checked the door again, yanking it open. The porch was empty, but something caught his eye. A small bundle of sticks tied together with red string. What's that? Rachel asked. Chris picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Looks like some kind of craft. A joke, maybe? Just leave it, Sam said, his voice tense. Chris tossed it into the bushes and locked the door. They tried to shake off the unease, but the air in the cabin felt heavier. Every creak of the old wood made them jump. Then the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the only light coming from their phones. Great, Rachel muttered, fumbling for a flashlight. Stay calm, Chris said. It's probably just a breaker. I'll check it. As he walked toward the utility closet, they heard the knock again. This time, it wasn't on the door. It was on the window. All four of them froze, staring at the curtain-covered glass. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Don't look, Lily whispered, clutching Rachel's arm. Chris ignored her and pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. He let out a shaky laugh. See? Just... The words died in his throat as he noticed something. In the dirt just outside the window were footprints. Bare footprints. Someone's messing with us, Chris said, backing away. We should call the police. There's no service out here, Rachel reminded him. The knocking started again, this time on all the windows, surrounding them, closing in. Rachel screamed and Sam grabbed a knife from the kitchen. Whoever it is, stay away, he shouted. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for their ragged breathing. Then they heard it, a voice. Faint and raspy, it came from outside, circling the cabin. Come out, wherever you are. Lily burst into tears, and Rachel tried to comfort her, though her own hands were shaking. Stay together, Chris said, his voice firm. We're safer inside. But then they heard something that made their blood run cold. A key turning in the front door lock. Chris rushed to the door, throwing his weight against it as it began to creak open. The door was locked. How? Help me hold it, he shouted, and Sam joined him, shoving the door closed. Rachel grabbed Lily, pulling her toward the back of the cabin. Where are you going? Sam yelled. There's a back door, Rachel cried. But when they reached it, it was already open, swinging gently in the wind. Rachel slammed it shut, locking it. Someone's been inside. Then we're trapped, Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The knocking started again, louder and more frantic, as if dozens of fists were pounding on the walls of the cabin. Then the voice returned, louder and closer this time. You shouldn't have come here. Rachel turned to Lily. We have to run. What about the others? We'll come back for them. We just need to get help. Grabbing a flashlight, they threw the back door open and sprinted into the woods. The darkness swallowed them inside, branches clawing at their faces and clothes. The pounding on the cabin grew fainter as they ran, but the voice followed them, echoing through the trees. You can't escape. They didn't stop until they reached the dirt road. Rachel looked back, her flashlight trembling. There was nothing behind them. But when she turned back to Lily, her stomach dropped. Lily was gone. Rachel spun in circles, screaming her name, but the only response was the faint rustling of leaves. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing by the side of the road. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in total darkness. Rachel sobbed, her breath visible in the cold night air. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps approaching. Lily? She whispered. A figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't Lily. It was something else, its face pale and featureless, except for a wide, jagged grin. The last thing Rachel heard was the voice, low and mocking. You shouldn't have run. The cabin was found a week later, empty. The only sign of the four friends was a bundle of sticks tied with red string left on the porch. Locals say the woods are cursed, that anyone who enters never truly leaves. And at night, if you're quiet, you can still hear the knocking.
Story number 8.
They weren't supposed to be out this late. Ashley, Dylan, and Mia had underestimated the time it would take to hike back to their car after exploring the old trails of Black Hollow Woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew unnaturally dark, and an unsettling silence blanketed the air. "We should have turned back earlier," Ashley muttered, her flashlight slicing through the dense shadows. "Relax," Aunt Dylan said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "The car isn't far." Mia walked at the back of the group, her eyes darting nervously. "Why does it feel like we're being watched?" Ashley didn't answer, but she felt it too, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck. The trail seemed different now, unfamiliar. The tall trees pressed in closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Then, in the distance, they saw it, a faint, flickering light. "Is that a house?" Dylan asked, squinting. "Out here?" Ashley replied skeptically. "Maybe it's a cabin." "Whatever it is, let's check it out," Dylan said. "We can ask for directions or wait out the night." Mia hesitated. "I don't think we should go there. It feels wrong." "It's either that or wandering in circles," Dylan said, already heading toward the light. Reluctantly, Ashley and Mia followed. As they approached, the light resolved into an old lantern hanging from the porch of a decrepit cabin. The structure leaned to one side, its wooden boards weathered and gray. "This doesn't look like anyone's lived here for decades," Ashley said, wrinkling her nose. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "I don't think we should go inside," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Dylan ignored her, stepping onto the porch. The boards groaned under his weight. "Hello?" he called out, pushing the door open wider. The cabin's interior was dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. A table sat in the center of the room, and on it was an old photograph in a cracked frame. Ashley picked it up. The picture was of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, but their faces were blurred as though the photograph had been smeared. "Let's go," Mia said, tugging at Ashley's sleeve. Wait, Dylan said, pointing to a door at the back of the cabin. "There's something back there." "Don't," Mia pleaded, but Dylan was already opening the door. Inside was a staircase leading down into the darkness. "No way," Ashley said, shaking her head. "We're not going down there." But Dylan had already descended a few steps, his flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. "You've got to see this," he called up. Reluctantly, Ashley followed, with Mia trailing behind, tears in her eyes. The air grew colder as they descended, the steps creaking with each movement. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small basement. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. "What the hell is this?" Ashley whispered. The jars contained strange things, shriveled objects that looked like animal parts, cloudy liquids with floating shapes. In the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface covered in the same symbols as the walls upstairs. "Don't touch it," Mia begged as Dylan approached the chest, but he ignored her, kneeling to inspect it. "It's locked," he said. "That means we leave it alone," Ashley said firmly. Dylan ignored her too, yanking at the rusty lock. With a loud crack, the lock broke. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier. "Dylan, stop," Ashley said, backing away, but he lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle wrapped in black cloth. Dylan hesitated, then reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the cloth, the candle upstairs went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Mia screamed, and Ashley's flashlight flickered erratically. "Dylan, let's go," Ashley shouted. But Dylan just stared at the bundle, his face pale. "I can't move," he whispered. A sound began to fill the room, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then they saw it. In the far corner of the basement, something shifted in the shadows. A figure emerged, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs grotesquely elongated. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. It moved toward Dylan with unnatural speed, its long fingers reaching for him. "Run!" Ashley screamed, grabbing Mia and bolting up the stairs. Behind them, Dylan let out a blood-curdling scream that was cut off abruptly. Ashley and Mia didn't look back. They burst out of the cabin, the forest now pitch black. "Where's the trail?" Mia cried, panic overtaking her. "I don't know," Ashley said, her flashlight barely illuminating the trees. The growl returned, closer this time, echoing through the woods. Ashley grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her forward. "We can't stop," but Mia stumbled, falling to the ground. Ashley turned back to help her, but froze. Mia was staring behind her, her face a mask of terror. Ashley turned slowly. The figure was there, standing just feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It smiled, raising one long, clawed hand. Ashley screamed and everything went black. The cabin was found years later by hikers, but there was no trace of the three friends. Locals say the forest is cursed and those who wander too deep are never seen again. At night, some claim to hear distant screams and see a faint light flickering in the trees, the lantern on the cabin's porch, waiting for its next visitors.